Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. My name is Julian Richards. I'm the managing editor of Open Democracy. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a media organization, and our aim is to challenge power and inspire change around the world. Thanks for joining us. We want this conversation to involve you as much as possible. So particularly, I'd like to thank those of you who've already submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to be addressing as many of those as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, if you have a question or a comment for us, you can click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. If you're joining us from Facebook, you can add your input there and it'll be fed back. This is all pretty low tech, so please forgive any technical hitches, any bandwidth problems, interruptions from pets or stray children. With that, I'm going to hand over to Walid, who will be chairing it, and I'll see you again in 15 minutes. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, Julian. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us from across the world. And of course, thank you for the three speakers that we have. We are very excited to have this great panel. My name is Walid el Houri. I'm the partnerships editor at Open Democracy and lead editor of Open Democracy's North Africa and West Asia section. Today's conversation is part of Rethinking Populism. It's a partnership between Open Democracy and Lund University, Istanbul Bilgi University, the University of Helsinki, and the Academy of Finland's Mainstreaming Populism Consortium. The page brings together voices to contribute to politically urgent debates about how to develop effective progressive political strategies, and it is edited by Spyros Sofos, who is also with us today. You can check out some of the great work that's already published on the page if you follow the link that I will post now. So the recent US elections have exposed a deeply polarized society where far-right populism is alive and well. Almost half the voters voted for Donald Trump. The other half voted for Joe Biden, who for many is a far cry from the progressive change they would have hoped for. There are many questions about how we got here and many others about what the future holds for the US left after these elections. Before we start, I have the pleasure to introduce the three speakers. Seyla Benhabib is Professor Emerita of Political Science and Philosophy at Yale University and Senior Research Scholar and Professor Adjunct of Law at Columbia University. Jeremy Gilbert is Professor of Culture and Political Theory at the University of East London and the current editor of the journal New Formations. And Spyros Sofos is a researcher and research coordinator at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University. Thank you for joining us today. And I would like to start off with a question that I think many are asking, which is what can we learn from the results of these elections and what are the lessons for the left in particular? I want to have this, I suggest this conversation to be a bit open. So if anyone wants to jump in, go ahead. And also if you have any questions for each other or like any comments, please feel free to do so. So I want to first throw this general frame first to kind of pick up the conversation with that. If perhaps Seyla, you'd like to start.
Hey, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm an avid reader of Open Democracy for a number of years. Now, I think first, let's rejoice in a couple of things. I mean, we on the left, we tend a little bit, to doom and gloom. It is not that common for a sitting US president not to be re-elected to a second term. This is the first time since the 1992 election when Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush. Okay, so I think that we need to understand that is an important occasion in American democracy. Second, Joseph Biden won 52% of the vote, which is about 75 million. It is 5 million more than what Donald Trump has. By any measure, parliamentary democracies change governments with 10,000 votes difference, 100,000 votes difference. I mean, this is a substantial a difference in the popular vote because of the peculiarities of the American political system and its hangovers from the 18th century, its antiquated constitution. We have this thing called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College distorts the force of the popular vote. In fact, this is what it was intended to do. It was intended to bring Republican constraints onto majoritarianism and to persuade slave-owning smaller states to come in and join the Confederation on an equal basis. This is the, if you wish, the long arm of history on the present in the United States. So that's just to put it very formalistically, and I'll just add a couple more points. One is, as in the UK, we are all experiencing the issue of a post-industrial society and how, in effect, democracies can survive in post-industrial, increasingly knowledge-based service economies. The social physiognomy of those who voted for Donald Trump in the US is not all that different than those who voted for Brexit in the UK elections. In fact, I see a tremendous analogy between the class realignments in Brexit and what has happened here. So we can also approach it from that perspective about the dilemmas of electoral democracy in a period when the transformations of an industrial to a post-industrial and service economy has created new class alliances and new class resentments. And it's very difficult, to address these issues properly. Third point, and I'll stop with this, I think that the transformation of the social media world is really affecting democratic and public consciousness. It seems as if, I mean, among the many things that you can say about the Donald Trump phenomenon, this man who is so incompetent, who is so really ignorant, is nonetheless a media personality. And he knows how to play the media, and he knows how to play his followers via the media. I mean, it's no coincidence that apparently what he now thinks of doing post-election is start a new television network, and thus sort of keep provoking, keep misinforming, etc. This is also an enormous challenge to our understanding of democracy and the shared public sphere, truths in this public sphere, etc.
Thank you, Seyla. Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
Well, obviously I agree with everything Seyla has said, and I suppose the question of what we've learned partly depends on what we might have expected to happen, because in some ways, objectively, it doesn't seem. I mean, the point is well taken that it's unusual for an incumbent to fall. Although I also think now, after this election, we also have to say, if you look back over the past 40 years, one-term presidents are becoming less infrequent than they've conventionally been thought to be. But still, it is, that's. But in many ways, it's not. I would say, in many ways, it's sort of what you might have expected to happen. But I think to the extent that some expectations were confounded, or some expectations of what might happen over the whole year politically didn't, crystallize as people might have expected. I mean, for me, probably the thing which I learned has to do with the resilience of a sort of liberal centrist democratic establishment in the face of a challenge from the left and from the right. That a lot of the kind of analysis and expectations from the left since 2016 were really predicated on the assumption that the sort of neoliberal technocratic political elite represented by people like Clinton was in complete terminal crisis, and while I think it's still true, it is true that I still think that the long-term sort of loss of weakening of authority and sort of decline of that group, that elite, is a key historical fact of the moment. Where we are right now is that they're not as weak as we thought, as the people on the left hoped they were. That the left people on the left hoped that they thought they had completely collapsed, and that a new insurgent left populism represented by people like Sanders would be able to sort of fill that vacuum. And the extent to which, you know, I was there living in the States, working there for a few months during the primaries, and to be honest, the sort of the ease with which the Democratic establishment sort of saw off the challenge ultimately, and then got behind Biden was something fairly striking. I mean, one can overstate that, and I also think that one thing that a lot of commentary, especially kind of from international commentary, doesn't really seem to pick up on, it seems to me, is that, you know, Biden does have a sort of, I mean, it's very superficial and it's not relevant to anybody who actually knows his political track record, but as a performer, like, he does come across to audiences as something other than just the sort of sterile technocrat that Clinton came across as and others do. He comes across as a kind of folksy guy from the industrial, you know, northeastern industrial working class, you know, kind of like Bernie does actually. So, and he did manage to sell himself as a kind of more moderate, more plausible sort of version of Bernie. That was his sort of pitch during the primaries. And I don't know what the significance of that is, but I don't, because it does, you know, I think on the one hand we can read the whole process from January to now as that Democratic establishment reconsolidating itself, but also I think, you know, there's no question, I have no Biden's program or what he's likely to do or the people he'll have in the cabinet, but he did resonate with a desire for something other than a continuation of sort of third way politics, and the fact that he did resonate with that, I think, is also part of what we have to take account of. But I don't know, I mean, that leaves us in quite an uncertain situation.
I think we will come back to I think a lot to Bernie Sanders and the choice of Biden. But before that, I think I would like to hear if Spyros would like to add anything.
Yeah, very briefly, I would say that I agree with Seyla that this has been a victory that we need to take into account. And as also Jeremy emphasized, we cannot straitjacket our thinking in terms of centrist, leftist, and so on. We need to see the composite, I would say, personality and character of the forces that supported Biden as well. What I would like to emphasize, however, is that in this, with this positive note, of course, in mind, we also have seen polarization, and as Seyla said, this is the case in Britain and in other societies as well. Polarization has prevailed, and this, in my opinion, gives the left, broadly defined, I would say, both presents it with a serious challenge. It needs to articulate a new strategy to deal with this kind of polarization, to break these kinds of bubbles within which people inhabit. And at the same time, this polarization has also provided the left with an opportunity in some ways to yes, I would try to say it is both a challenge and an opportunity to try to overcome this polarization, find strategies, find a discourse, and find solutions that are necessary for what will follow in the next years.
I want to stop at one thing before we can expand a bit more on the results themselves and on analyzing them and analyzing what might happen from now. Is basically and it's basically maybe a question that should be before the title, right? And which is, when we talk about the left right now in the US, I mean, this is a question that can be asked in any other country as well. What constitutes the American left today? And if we can kind of try to define it somehow, or create kind of a frame that when we refer to the left in the US, what does that, what is that, what falls within that, and also what kind of what is a leftist agenda today in the US in the present context after these elections? I mean, maybe after this whole year, not only after the election. So I don't know if this is like, maybe I think it's an important question to begin with before analyzing further.
I mean, I'm very much in agreement with Jeremy about the Sanders phenomenon, and it does address something, Walid, that you have in mind as well. I came to this country 50 years ago. I've now lived here my life more than in Turkey and so on, and I was always expecting a third party, a third left party. You know, I had this parliamentary democracy model in my mind. I remember in my undergraduate years, there was something called the New American Movement, NAM. And we always thought that this movement would materialize into a party. This duopoly party system here is impossible to get through. It is a wonder, in a way, that American democracy survives this duopoly. But over the years, I have come to believe that the real place for the left is the interaction of strong social movements and whatever openings and chances and possibilities there are within the Democratic Party. And I think for me, Sanders is the most marvelous exemplar of this. I voted for Sanders in the primaries, of course. And he energized millions of young people. I am convinced that the Democrats would not have won this election had it not been for the Sanders phenomenon. Sanders really galvanized and energized activists in the party. He brought a lot of young people in. He opened the discourse, and he and also Kamala Harris really gave Biden a run for his money during the elections. Then what happened, however, is the strange phenomenon, if you will recall, in South Carolina, one of the famous foremost African-American congressmen basically made it clear that Black Americans were not going to support Sanders. And this is a difficult lesson for the left to swallow or to understand, okay? So I'm in complete agreement there with Jeremy's point. And where we are now is, I think, probably one needs to understand why the Democrats did so badly in the House of Representatives. And the two senatorial races are still outstanding in Georgia, and I have some hope that at least one will come to the Democrats. But there are a lot of questions about alliances. Whatever model exists for the American left, it is not a European parliamentary model. We just have to, until the Constitution gets changed, which was probably unlikely, we have to live with another phenomena and think of the place of the left within that.
Jeremy, do you want to add anything to this?
Well, of course, I agree with everything everyone's saying. I think I would say so if I didn't, but I think the in terms of your question, like what is the left? I mean, I think to some extent, I mean, really, in some ways, the function of the Sanders movement, just like the function of the Corbyn movement here, was to answer that question in a clearer way than it could have been answered at any time in the past 30 years. Yeah, there is now an identifiable sort of democratic socialist movement, which has as its institutional political objective the nomination of openly socialist candidates for nominations within the Democratic Party. That's its main strategy. There are some dissenters within the DSA, for example, who want to run autonomous socialist candidates in cities where you have a very radical electorate, which is fine. But I think that's part of the same ecology, really. And I don't think it's going to it doesn't look to me like overall it's going to result in any break of that two-party system. So, and I think there is a left, and it is the democratic socialist movement, which Sanders crystallized, and there's a whole new, there's a kind of revived media ecology around it, that, you know, things like Jacobin and, you know, things like Verso selling a lot more books, you know, all kind of manifest. There's also a kind of ongoing, I think that the broader ecology of the left, there is that. There is also the sort of what we might call what's now in a fairly old-fashioned notion, the sort of progressive movement, which is really kind of manifest by Elizabeth Warren. I think we see how weak that is now, actually, in how poor her showing was. That it basically represents a constituency of people really in the professional classes who are committed to a sort of critique of neoliberalism and a social democratic project, but they're not willing to endorse any form of explicit anti-capitalism in the way that Sanders was. But they are definitely part of the left, and they are a part of the left which any left political project has to include, actually, if it's going to be successful. And then there is the kind of neoliberal third way, you know, which still controls the DNC and the upper echelons of the democratic establishment, which it's highly debatable whether we regard that as a section of the left. I think part of the problem is I think you can't meaningfully call them part of the left. And in fact, there are a set of institutionalized interests that regard that broader left formation as their principal rival, as the principal threat to their privileges. And that, but I think it is. I think in many ways it's clear. It's much clearer now what is left. Of course, Seyla's also completely right that the lifeblood of that left, it is the social movements. You know, of course it is. It's not just a sort of institute, but there have been like social movements and activist movements all the time. I think what's really changed now is that the Sanders movement, it did give it crystallized a certain identity. But I think and in this, the situation isn't really different, say, to the UK. But the fundamental strategic problem for the left was, how do you maintain the progress of developing this identity for democratic socialism as a political project, while also maintaining positive rather than just kind of rivalrous relationships with this kind of progressive bloc who are, you know, genuinely social democratic but really not socialist, and what do you do about the fact that the institution, the parties and the institutions which you need to sort of use as a vehicle are still basically controlled by an elite which regard all of those formations as rivals, as enemies to be contained, and that those are the fundamental strategic problems, I think, for the left. But I think we do sort of know what the left is much better than we did, like, for the past 30 years. And in some ways, that's the most decisive change of the past 5 years with the previous 30, certainly in both Britain and the States. That I think another issue is issue for us to think about. I mean, one of the problems is I don't know if I will still think this tomorrow, but I sort of wonder if one of the issues is that, I mean, something I used to say, I said to students for years and years, actually, this is really just about the British case. I always used to say, well, if you go look at things like the social attitude surveys, you look at polls of people's political opinions, there is a big left constituency, but it's completely disaggregated. It has no political representation. It's out of the political process. Like, you look at, if you actually ask people their opinions about capitalism, equality, distribution questions, you know, there was always sort of 20 to 30% of the electorate who would give a consistently kind of leftist or socialist answer to those questions. I think that was probably also true in the States. And one of the things that's happened is, for the first time in a generation, is that constituency has cohered, has become conscious of itself, has become visible to others and to itself. Whether it's actually really any bigger than it was sort of 5 years ago, I'm not sure. Because I think it seems to me part of the problem for the left in the States is I guess it's certainly got a new lease of life with young people. It's certainly got this kind of generational shift. But you know, in the end, you know, I don't know if the proportion of votes that Bernie got was really significantly larger than a kind of populist left candidate would have got 15 years ago if they'd been able to articulate their position. I don't know. So. But of course, that's not something to be despondent about, right? Because I think, given how completely disaggregated the left was, given the fact that we couldn't even answer that question meaningfully 5 years ago, like what even is the left other than a hypothetical formation? Just the very fact that we can now point to something and say, look, here's an organised left. I mean, that's a significant gain, even if it hasn't yet grown to the point of being able to really achieve much.
Spyros, what do you think about that?
I would like to say, first of all, that I like very much the notion of left ecologies, because I think that's the way I would approach the left. And as Seyla said, that the left is probably the phenomenon at the where possibly organized politics and social movements meet. If I can oversimplify what she said earlier. What I would like, however, to emphasize is that we need also to keep an open mind with regards to what we see in the United States today and in other societies. For example, we have the crystallization of left activism and politics in the case of the Sanders phenomenon, or the younger democratic candidates that have radical agendas. At the same time, we have social movements that are, I would say, centered around the issues of identity. We have also, however, local social movements that have not fully become part of what we call the left. And I think this is a challenge that the left needs to address in the near future, because I think this is a laboratory of politics, of progressive politics. And of course, we have more traditional left constituencies that have, I think for the most part, been depoliticized by the shift of the Democratic Party towards away from the politics that relates to labor relations and so on, and redistribution. I would see this diversity, this disaggregation, but this diffusion, but at the same time, this potential dynamism that exists in American society, as well as in British, in French, and other societies. And I think that therefore we need to make a distinction between the left as is and the left as it can be if one devises and articulates policies and discourses that can maximize the effect of the progressive mood that exists at local, national, translocal level in many ways.
Thank you, Spyros. I think this actually maybe relates to a question or that we got from Joseph Farag from the audience. And I think I would add to that maybe to frame also an answer around what kind of what do we learn from these elections in terms of the electability of a leftist agenda in the US. And the question was that consistently we see strong majorities in favor of leftist or at least social democratic policies, even among Republican voters. And this is usually attributed to political tribalism, so to speak, in the US. Is it that simple, do you think? And or what other dynamics contribute to this phenomenon?
I'm not exactly sure if this is the answer, but we're having a conversation, so I'll just share some thoughts. I mean, what is this ideological phenomenon called Trumpism, okay? Because, you know, we are hearing and saying, okay, Trump lost, but Trumpism lives on, and it will live on. What is this phenomenon? And it certainly has a lot to do with working class, particularly male identification, and maybe also white male working class identification, though, as we have seen, the votes of the Hispanics and to a lesser extent, Black males has emerged as a bit of a puzzle in this election. Why does this man who actually represents the most corrupt aspect of the cosmopolitan elite, why is he able to mobilize millions of people by ranting and raging against the cosmopolitan elite of which he's a part? I mean, I have gone back, my tradition, to the Frankfurt School sometimes, and I've thought about this phenomenon that Adorno in particular was very attentive to, and that is the question of projective identification. I mean, when they were when they wrote about Mussolini or Hitler, for example, they talked about the little big man, the phenomena of the little big man, that the little man identifies, you know, with the big man, who in the end is going to screw him up, just as, you know, Trump, his tax cuts are for the millionaires. They're nothing for, you know, ordinary working families. But there is this phenomenon of resentment of the elites, resentment of technocracy, resentment of party structures that seem unresponsive, and then this identification with these figures. It's also an aspect of, you know, I think American libertarianism, anti-government attitudes, which I don't believe are that widespread in the UK, and a strong dose of racism, which we haven't yet talked about. I mean, the day that Barack Obama got elected, okay, and Obama himself is equivocal about neoliberalism and so on, we know that. But I think the day that he got elected, a certain segment of the ruling elite in this country saw blood. And Mitch McConnell said, the current leader of the Senate still, and I think a man of whom we have to be very scared and follow him very carefully, he said, I'm going to make him a one-term president. And this is now the danger also that, you know, with the blockage in the Senate, that, you know, these forces of resentment, Trumpism may try to make the Democrats again a one-term, and after that, it won't be that good. But sorry, I'm just saying a number of things here, but maybe, you know, to think back with Adorno is not the worst thing we can do.
Jeremy, what do you think?
Also, I agree with all that. I mean, I think in relation to the question the question about why do people, which is completely related to everything Seyla was just saying as well. The question of, well, why do people? I mean, it's the old question: why don't people vote for their own interests? But also, very specifically, I mean, this is certainly I wasn't following the polls closely in the US all through the 90s, but this goes in the UK. This goes right back to the early 90s. The phenomenon of people clearly saying they want a social democratic program and they're not necessarily voting for it. And the problem, and my impression, very much my impression when I was in the States earlier this year, my impression of the UK general elections here in 2017-19, and my impression going back to when I was, you know, living in kind of late Thatcherism in the northwest of England, in what are now the post-industrial regions, is that the phenomenon is not that hard to understand if you think that when people say they would like a social democratic program, it's not the same thing as saying they believe that the current formation of the political left is capable of delivering it. And there's something quite significant to me about the fact that this phenomenon really starts, I mean, in global terms, I think this phenomenon starts in the immediate wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. On some level, from that point on, there is this kind of deep sense of pessimism and sort of fatalism amongst those working class constituencies in particular, who want, you know, with the kind of loyal backbone of the labour movement and the socialist movement. And there is, I think there is, I mean, my fear is sometimes I think, you know, in a very pessimistic moment, I think what's happening is people do have a sort of deep intuition that the balance of forces is such that the left can't actually deliver the programme it says it could deliver, even though they would like it to. Of course, the problem is then you have a sort of chicken and egg, you have a circular situation. You know, how do you build up the left as a mass movement to the point where it could physically deliver? Because let me be clear, like lots of people, I think it's probably the case that if Bernie had got the nomination, the Democratic establishment would have destroyed it. And if he got the presidency, he would have been unable to deliver anything, because he just doesn't have a mass movement on this kind of scale that would have been necessary, or a weakened capitalist class on the scale that would have made it possible to implement something like the New Deal right now. That's probably all true. So there's this sort of circular question then, well, how do you build up a movement? How do you assemble forces to the point where it actually becomes plausible? I think, I mean, what I'm saying is, I think conversely, I think, you know, these voters who might vote for Obama and then they might vote for Trump, I think on some level, I don't think it's a conscious process of sort of rational choice, but on some level, they are thinking, well, I would like a social democratic program, but I'm not going to get that. It's not going to happen. It will fail, and so therefore I'll at least have my white privilege kind of reinforced, because that's something. I'll get something out of this program, and I think it really, we have to conceptualize the way in which voters, especially white male voters, a lot of the time are behaving as, they are sort of, they're not, it's not impossible that they could go for socialism or communism if it looked like it's going to work, if it's actually going to deliver the kind of outcomes that it would like to. But if they think it's not going to work, then they're going to just defend their existing social privileges, because why not? I mean, why not? Why sacrifice those privileges for a project that isn't actually going to be able to deliver the kind of outcomes it would like? So, of course, that does put us in a circular problem, the strategic question. And I don't have an immediate answer to the question, well, how do we build up our forces to the point where it then becomes plausible that people should ally themselves with us, and then they will actually get the social democratic program that they want. But I think that sort of paradox, actually, I think that has to be recognized as the paradox that we're up against. And, we have to sort of both build up our forces and also recognize that until those forces are built to a certain point, then a lot of people won't believe, and will probably rightly not believe, that we are capable of implementing a program. And I think that's why I question, like, why do people say they want social democracy and then they don't vote for it? Well, they don't vote for it when they have not been persuaded that voting for it will actually deliver it. And that might be that might be pure ideology. It might be that they've been deluded, they've been demoralized, it might be untrue, but it might also be an intelligent reading of the balance of forces at a given conjuncture. And that poses us with very specific strategic dilemmas, to which I don't know the answer, but the first step to resolving them is at least acknowledging the nature of that dilemma, I think.
Before I hear from Spyros, I will add one thing to Spyros, actually, because when we had the conversation with Chantal Mouffe and Paulo Gerbaudo a couple of weeks ago, we spoke about the need for protection as a driving force in politics, and I think this kind of resonates a bit with with the question that Jeremy added. So, like, how can the left provide the sense of trust that it can deliver protection, or it can deliver like something that people are looking for, but do not trust that they can get it from like this or that candidate, right? So we can also think of what would be the alternatives to doing that, to providing the sense of protection. So I wanted to hear also, Spyros, maybe like your take on that.
Thank you. Yes, I think that both what Seyla said about Trumpism is extremely valid, and we need to bear in mind that when we discuss the future of the left and its prospects, we need to analyze Trumpism, or whatever else we can call this phenomenon. And of course, Jeremy gave us a very good kind of roundup of the dilemmas the left faces with regards to these demands for, let's say, welfare states, this type of protection and so on. I could go on talking about this, but sanity will prevail, and I will just very, very briefly try to say the following. Drawing on British historian E.P. Thompson, I will use the notion of moral economy that he developed when he was analyzing the English crowd in late Middle Ages, early modernity. What is a moral economy? A moral economy is I would say, a diffuse set of ideas that revolve around the notion of justice, social justice, the ability to enjoy some basic protection and so on. But Thompson makes a very clear point, arguing that translating this moral economy into a political economy, into a political program, requires a lot of extra work. So I would say that most electorates, most segments of the electorate would want to see a more just system that gives them more chances to live a reasonably good life. I think that what the left has not done is translate this into something akin to a political program. Part of the reasons for that, I think, has to do with if one looks at the electoral geography of the United States and how the left has fared within that context, we will see that there is a huge divide between urban and rural areas, between suburbs and urban areas, and one can talk about north-south and so on. I think that this presents the left with a huge challenge because although it has managed to get through and concretize a political program that translates this yearning for social justice in the urban spaces of the United States, it has not done so in a lot of other areas. And I think that's why earlier I talked about local politics. I think that the left needs to take word by word, constituency by constituency, not only in the United States, but also in Britain and elsewhere, and try to translate ideas like the Green New Deal, for example, into local, realistic and enforceable programs, which do not offer protection, but empower the citizen. I insist on this distinction between protection and empowering, because protection, I think the validation of the notion of protection will result into another Trump, possibly, much more serious, much more effective, and much more authoritarian than what we had at this moment. I think I will stop here. I think I have the gist of what I want to say.
Thank you, Spyros. I think I would maybe also building on that, I'm thinking like we've been talking about also a lot about the positives, which I think is great. But I'm wondering, like seeing now how like some, you know, some names and some hints at what the Biden administration will be. And we've heard also a lot of criticism about the, already how to keep the pressure on the Biden administration to fulfill some of the promises towards this leftist agenda that we're talking about. How do you think this is, like, how do you see this materializing? Because in a way, like, I don't know what do you think of the signs that are the building of the new administration in terms of whether this will actually advance a real change, or even within the limits of the American system, let's say. But is it going to, is it promising to be adding some kind of leftist agenda to the program?
Well, I'm very glad that we've been talking for about 45 minutes and we haven't talked about COVID-19 or the Corona crisis. It's just like every morning, you know, I can't listen to the news without my brain getting rattled. And it's maybe a good thing that we haven't, but this is going to be the first item on the agenda of any reasonable social democratic progressive government. And Jeremy made a distinction between the progressive movement around the progressive movement it has always had more scientific, technocratic elements throughout American history and probably the history of many, many other countries as well. But at this point in time, I think good government is really important, because if the Biden administration does not achieve trust in the first 100 days by showing a comprehensive plan that incorporates the best of medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, and economic management into this, we're lost. I mean, I'm maybe exaggerating a little, but I think what Spyros said is very true, because if the Republicans manage in having this administration go down, and the Senate constantly opposes any reasonable program, and if the Democrats make mistakes, then the rage of the Trumpistas, or however you want to call them, will be enormous. Okay, so there is a lot at stake. Not only is there now, this assignment, the hope for us all, after all, this is a global pandemic, that maybe we can turn this around in some ways and bring the economies back in some ways, talking points. But it's also crucially important for any kind of faith that a center, progressive, mildly left reform-oriented administration can bring anything. Otherwise, we will end up with a new kind of regime, which, you know, Fintan O'Toole, whom I like a lot, though he's very dramatic, calls electoral autocracy, right? Which is what we have with, you know, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and, you know, these are electoral, but they're not democracies. They're not them. So this is the thing. So far, I think that because the transition process in administrative agencies, etc., has not been accomplished, well, I don't think any names are coming across except Biden's spokesperson and this COVID committee that he appointed with three, one previous person who had, Surgeon General who had served in the Obama administration, a professor from Yale University, and someone else. So I don't have any sense of other names for the cabinet at the moment.
Jeremy, what do you think?
I can't add much to what Seyla says. I'm not massively optimistic that precisely the nightmare scenario she delineates will not occur, basically, because ultimately my fear is that in order to enact that a program which would actually resolve the crisis, they would have to incorporate some of the left and its demands. And in the end, I'm afraid the democratic establishment would rather retain their institutional positions and privileges while in an electoral autocracy than concede them, you know, for the sake of saving democracy. That's my fear. But I completely agree that if that is to be avoided, then that is what needs to happen. And that, you know, we can't already. I think for that reason, I think we probably, you know, it's probably not helpful to go full oppositionalist in relation to Biden right now.
Yeah.
You know, there'll be plenty. There's only, I think Seyla's right. It's only there's only 3 months. It's only going to take 3. We only have to wait for 3 months to see if we need to do that or not. So we might as well give them 3 months.
Yes, what do you think?
Well, I think that as Seyla said, the Biden administration has a bet to win in some ways. So it has to perform in ways that will restore, I would say also, trust in institutions, which has been undermined systematically by the discourse and practice of Trump, and their efficacy as well. And as Jeremy said, we have to wait, of course. What I would like to add is that the left, if we look at the left, not as the entire Democratic Party, but the left-leaning parts of it, has also other work to do apart from potentially waiting to see if it's going to oppose or not the leadership of the Democratic Party and the administration. I think it has to continue the work it started in building alliances in different parts of the country, reaching out and in some ways identifying some of the reasons that have alienated a lot of voters from the Democratic Party, from its left, and at the same time finding ways to go back to my previous response, to turn the moral economic types of demands into something more concrete political. I think once the left has this kind of successful strategy in place, any Democratic Party leadership would ignore it at its own peril, if I can be a little bit optimistic, and I exaggerate in some ways. Yes.
Thank you, Spyros. We don't have much time, but before we conclude, I wanted to add another question that kind of takes us a bit away from the US, because at the end, like, American politics are not really only American. So, and a lot of countries are also concerned deeply by any transformation. in American politics. So in that sense, what is the international responsibility somehow of the American leftist agenda? Because there's also, I mean, we can, I mean, there are a lot of other things to discuss when it comes to social justice in the US itself, whether, and especially like the issue of racism, which has been one of the most important issues under Trump, but always, as well as gender and other issues that are quite prominent in the leftist agenda within the US. But there is often, I think, I feel like we see a lot of criticism towards the American left that when it comes to its responsibility in terms of solidarity or in terms of learning or hearing from other struggles outside of the US, or seeing them not from an American perspective. And I wonder what you think about the leftist agenda or the leftist perspective today, whether it has changed even when it comes to looking at the rest of the world in terms of solidarity, or in terms of other ways of impacting internal American politics.
Walid, I'm so glad, I didn't mean to jump in, but I'm so glad that you brought this issue up, because both right and left-wing populism thrive on the protectionist and, in some cases, somewhat ethno-nationalistic sentiments that are out there in the face of a world economy that is out of control, where the neoliberal institutions that were established, like the World Bank, like the WTO, is basically they're oiling the engines and making this thing run. But it's obvious that there is a great deal of rage in many countries of the world about this situation, losing control, losing sovereignty, whatever else, and the displaced rhetoric in the UK of the conservatives losing control to the European Union, and yet submitting now the UK economy to the sort of the whims of the larger Chinese market, right? I mean, the capitalist class is confused about this as well. What do they do? The protectionism or regionalism, internationalism? We need to think very deeply about this, because I always, some of my good friends on the left say to me, Seyla, you're too much of a cosmopolitan. Maybe by birth and life history, I can be nothing but a cosmopolitan. I grew up with 3 languages at home, etc., and with a long history and memory about Europe. But the question is, what is really our answer? Deglobalization? Well, what exactly does that mean? In some areas of the economy, maybe it is okay to return back to certain forms of self-sufficiency, to decouple from these, to uncouple from these global commodity chains. Yes, fine. I don't know that much about it, but that seems to me to be plausible. But no, we're not going to go back to the age of autarkic nation states. This is baloney, put very simply. Look at what China announced. They announced an enormous free trade zone. And Obama worked for many, many years on this Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which I'm sure has problems. And all these regional huge trade agreements have problems for the left, because they do bring competition. They can mean diminished controls, but we have to get in there, and we have to provide answers to this. I mean, Bernie used to be much more protectionistic the first time he ran. This time he's not program. I don't think there was exactly a program, but he was much more internationalist and much more open to international solidarity and dialogue. And he a point about it. But I do believe it is a tension within the left. I do believe, like, you know, I read Yanis Varoufakis a lot on this, the good old Trotsky, you know, for internationalist left. And I think that, yeah, you know, it's not going to go away. You know, we have to try to square the circle in some way, but there is no manner of thinking away from this problem.
Thank you, Seyla. Jeremy, would you like to add anything?
Well, sure. I mean, I wouldn't be particularly critical of the US left, you know, certainly not compared to the British left, frankly, in terms, you know, the British, I mean, the British, you know, people, and I think it's not really just a question of the left or not. To some extent, you know, the relative internationalism of different national lefts is partly a function of what the wider national culture is like and the national media culture is like. And, you know, it's been you know, as said, is already, you know, gestured towards. It's been a dilemma for the left and the anti-capitalist left since the 1840s. Like, how do you negotiate the fact that capitalism and imperialism and colonialism are global phenomena, and yet politics is still conducted primarily at the level of the national popular, as Gramsci calls it. How do you negotiate that? And there's no singular answer to the question. It remains a dilemma. I think, because I mean, historically, we know that if an organized left tries to move too far ahead of the rest of the population, nationalism and international solidarity, then it just loses any connection with that base. On the other hand, if it doesn't push, if it doesn't act as an agitating force to cosmopolitanize and internationalize the outlook of its own constituencies, then it becomes complicit with forms of nationalism, and which don't ultimately serve its purposes. So there's no sort of theoretical answer to the question, apart from that one has to always, I think, be making a strategic judgment about how far can you push to internationalize your perspectives without losing people, and how do you make sure you are doing that. And I agree. I mean, one has to say that Bernie and his movement did that. They made a judgment, they pushed it, they responded to criticism, they pushed, and they. So I think I couldn't be particularly critical of them. And I think it does. But I agree that ultimately, I agree that there's all. I mean, we know from the historical experience that there's a severe limit to how far the left can occupy a position of nationalist protectionism. You know, we know that. We know that, as you know, my friend, you know, Mark Fisher always used to say, there's a reason National Socialism has a bad name. You know, it's not, of course there is. So I think, and I think the idea, and we've seen in Europe, or we've seen in Western Europe over the past few years, that it's not that easy for the left just to say, right, we're going to be the people arguing for national sovereignty. Nobody's done it. Nobody has successfully prosecuted that version of a left populist project, which simply occupies the space of a kind of reductive nationalism. On the other hand, historically, you know, social democratic projects have always appealed to some notion of the national community, the national collectivity as the space within which the moral economy, as you put it, Spyros, and as Thompson put it, will be exercised. So I think all we can ever do really is be as attentive to those issues as possible, and push as far as we can realistically at any given moment.
Thank you, Jeremy. Spyros, if you have anything to add before we conclude.
Very briefly, I would say that we have an additional challenge that is represented by the current context, the pandemic, and for example, the shortages in PPE at the earliest stages. At the same time, I would say the deindustrialization of large chunks of the American hinterland that have voted Republican in the last two elections will force the left and have to, in many ways, to reconnect with these communities by and respond to these challenges by, I would say, bringing back some localized production, so going a little bit against the grain of the greater and greater neoliberal globalization that led us to shortages early on. I think this is something that presents a danger for the left, in the sense that this is very close to what we would call protectionism, and some people will demand this in many ways. I believe that the left has therefore a very fine balancing act in reinvigorating local economies, in bringing new kinds of opportunities for work, and some of this would be production, and at the same time retaining I would say, a global ethos, taking, I would say, protectionism and nationalism the protectionism and the excessive neoliberalism out of globalization in some ways, to continue being, have a global horizon, but at the same time taking care of local communities, and ensuring that they are on board with its vision.
Thank you, Spyros. Thank you, everyone. I will leave the floor to Julian now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for such a incredibly sort of thoughtful discussion. If you would like to know more about this stuff, as Walid said at the beginning, you can follow our Rethinking Populism series, which he edits, and Spyros. This is in the link I've just put in the chat. We have a whole series of interesting live discussions coming up with two over the following 2 weeks about the future of migration from the Ryerson University Collective and associated friends. You can follow all of those on our live discussions page, which I've just put in the chat as well, where you can also see the recording of this, which will be there, I hope, tomorrow morning. Finally, if you'd like to know more about open democracy itself, not quite finally, if you'd like to know more about open democracy itself, we have a weekly newsletter. I'd encourage you all to sign up to it. It's great. And lastly, if you think what we do is valuable, well, please consider supporting us. We rely on ordinary people to keep going. Thank you very much. I hope you'll join us again, and thank you very much to the panelists as well. Good night.
Thank you.